Welcome to the third episode of the Engineered Perspectives podcast, where every episode offers you a different perspective on the diverse world of engineering. My name is Philip, and in today's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with DeVault, an open source developer whose projects are used by hundreds of thousands of people. Some of you might know Drew as the creator of Sway, the i3 window manager replacement for Wayland. However, Drew is also behind other noteworthy open source projects, such as SourceHut, a suite of tools for project management and software development, and Hare, a systems programming language designed for simplicity, stability, and longevity. In this interview, we also explore whether Drew will revisit Linux for mobile, his perspective on the latest developments in AI, his journey to working full-time on open source projects, and his ambitious goal of creating a programming language that will endure for 100 years. Please enjoy this episode, and I am looking forward to any feedback. So do you remember what your first line of code was that you wrote?
It was a very long time ago. I don't know what line of code it was, but I can tell you roughly what it was for, and it's surprising. The very first experience I had with programming was making browser games in JavaScript with HTML4.
Okay. So when was that? Do you remember?
I must have been 9 or 10 years old, so it would have been 99, 2000.
Okay. So a little time ago.
Yeah.
I also have a second question for you. That is, what was your first project you contributed to?
The first one I contributed to? Gosh, it must have been some early calculator hacking projects, just some light contributions. That was the first community I participated in, and contributing code versus ideas, I'm not really sure. But the first project that I made and spent a lot of work on was NightOS, an operating system for calculators.
Okay, cool. So now let's dive into some Linux stuff.
Yeah.
And one thing that I found really interesting was you wrote about using Linux as on your mobile phone. Mm-hmm. And you also wrote that you switched back to an Android-based operating system.
Yeah.
And I would love to get your just general opinion on mobile Linux. Will there be a future, or is it going to be Android and iOS?
I think that it's a really interesting project or set of projects that people are working on. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done in order to make a good mobile phone operating system. And I think the main problem that mobile Linux faces is that Linux is a great operating system for the niches in which it's established, which means it's a great desktop operating system, it's a great server operating system, but it's not really at all established in the mobile niche in the same way. And a lot of the fundamental technology that's needed to make a mobile device work is not really accommodated for in Linux presently. And so what you see on mobile Linux is a bunch of stuff which is fairly easy to translate across from its current niches to the mobile niche. Like if you cross-compile Firefox for ARM and you port Linux to an ARM device, you have Firefox. But all of the stuff specific to mobile, like the good telephony stack and things like this, have to be developed from scratch. And I think those are still pretty early. And they're absolutely essential for mobile Linux to succeed as people's daily driver and to be useful and reliable. And I think it's going to take a lot of work to get there. And it's really easy, I think, for people who are just enthusiastic about hacking on an ARM device to reach for playing with the stuff which translates more easily from desktop Linux rather than putting their boots in and doing the low-level work of building out reliable telephony stacks. I think if the community is able to focus in on building good telephony support, the rest of it will come really easily. So the future of Linux, I think, is going to hinge on getting that put together.
Do you think you will ever try it again?
I hope so. I really do.
Cool. So now about desktop Linux. Mm-hmm. There was a blog post that Alpine Linux is your one-stop solution, or was to the point. Okay, it is still is.
Still today.
Okay. And is there any other distro that you find interesting or that you tried out in the last month or years?
I mean, I've used many different Linux distros over the years, and I see the appeal and the The advantages and disadvantages of many of them. My first distro ever was OpenSUSE, actually, and then the first one I really used was Mint and Ubuntu in this family. I spent some time on Arch Linux. Eventually, I landed on Alpine. I've also spent some time with some of the BSDs. And I think all of them have their different niches and different use cases to which they apply. And Alpine Linux works well for me as kind of a one-stop solution, but that's in part because I'm able to adapt it and work on it and make it fit my use cases more so than it perhaps fitting in naturally or out of the box. But yeah, I've messed around with some other stuff recently. I have a laptop that I recently installed Debian on with Cinnamon just for the sole purpose of installing a proprietary scanner driver. And that was quite annoying, but all I had to do was install a deb and call it a day. So I had no other choice, really. And then I recently installed NetBSD on another computer to help with the Hare port and also to research like package source, which is their solution for packaging on NetBSD, because I thought it might apply to another project of mine. So I spent some time with different systems here and there and keep their trade-offs in mind. But for the most part, when I just need something reliable, it's Alpine for me.
Okay, great. That's a good answer.
Thank you.
So now let's switch to some general stuff. And one thing I always find interesting, especially for people such as yourself that have a lot of projects and a lot of different problem spaces, is how do you learn new topics, new technologies, and what is your approach to just getting familiar with all that?
I think it's, for me, it mostly comes down to not being afraid to learn. Or even not being afraid to try. So I find that most of the time, if I sit down with the problem in an unfamiliar programming language or an unfamiliar domain, if I can get over the fear of it being unfamiliar, and if I just allow myself to give it a shot, to open up the code, to play with it, to try to get the toolchain working, it's usually enough to make enough headway to start learning. And learning by doing, of setting out with a particular problem I have to solve, or fixing a bug in some software that I use, or whatever the case may be, setting out with a goal that I care about and need is good motivation to actually learn enough to solve the problem, given that I allow myself to try without being afraid of the unknown.
Do you supplement the learning by doing with things like books or any other media?
Not so much. I don't supplement with books per se, or like tutorial videos or tutorial blog posts, that kind of thing. At this point, with the kind of work that I do, the most reliable sources for learning are reference manuals and API documentation, specifications especially, because if you learn how to read specificationese, as it were, they are always the most comprehensive and reliable source of information about whatever problem you're looking at.
So what is your tool stack that you use to just work on stuff right now from software and hardware perspective?
Well, from hardware, I just have a fairly standard PC that I built myself several years ago, and I've been maintaining ever since. It's not particularly anything special. I don't need anything special. I also have, my laptop, also unremarkable. And then more remarkable is I have a few test beds for strange architectures. So I have an ARM box on my network that I log into. I need to work with ARM, and I have a RISC-V machine, which is usually powered off, but when I need to touch RISC-V, I boot it up. So the hardware is fairly unremarkable outside of the specialized cases. In terms of software, also pretty unremarkable. I spend 95% of my time just working with Vim and Git and a shell.
Okay, do you use, I think you use NeoVim, at least I saw some config files.
Yeah, I use NeoVim for a long time, but I don't especially use anything attractive about NeoVim as most users would compare it to Vim. I just use it like I used Vim. And recently, the latest update broke some of my stuff, and I almost switched back to Vim over it, but I just buttoned down the hatches and figured out the config changes instead.
Okay. So is there a specific reason why you don't use the stuff that NeoVim, or a lot of people use today, NeoVim 4?
I use Vim plug and I use FCF to open files quickly. And then I have some plugins mostly for adding syntax highlighting for various languages that aren't upstreamed in Vim. But other than that, I don't really customize Vim that much. I don't try to turn it into the IDE experience. I really prefer the approach of Vim as my editor and Unix as my IDE. And I think that's something which is a lot more flexible for me.
Okay. Do you think there's a bad thing or disadvantage to using NeoVim with the IDE experience?
I suppose I could tease out some disadvantages, but I would have to qualify them by saying that whatever makes any individual programmer feel more productive and efficient at home is obviously the right solution for them. But if I were to pull out some disadvantages or advantages compared between the IDE approach and my approach, I would mainly just focus on the fact that by using Unix as my IDE and Vim strictly as an editor, all of the tools that I use in Unix, I have an everyday familiarity with them because I depend on them so much throughout my workflow. It also forces me to be very skilled with Git because I'm using it directly from the command line all day, every day. And these tools are composable and scriptable in a way which makes your workflows automatable. In a way which is much easier than if you try to automate a workflow that's based on a lot of features provided by an IDE. So I think there are advantages in these respects, but again, whatever makes you happy when you're coding is what makes you happy when you're coding. So I don't think it's any better or worse than whatever somebody else is doing.
Okay, cool. So you don't use an LSP, right? Okay, so maybe about that specific case, because I think a lot of people these days depend on LSPs. Why don't you use one? Or what would be the replacement for that?
I find that it's not especially necessary for my workflow and the way that I interact with the code base. I certainly see the appeal, and I've thought about helping to implement one to make it easier to write Hare code for people that benefit from this workflow. But for some reason, it just never clicked with me, and I can't really explain why. But I will confess that I did use an LSP for the first time a couple of months ago. I set up VS Code for that purpose, just for a specific task I had to accomplish, where I had to do some very serious widespread refactoring across a very large code base, and being able to just use the tools to rename symbols and so on was kind of essential for that purpose. But yeah, outside of that one specific time where I had a really compelling use case for a language server, it's just never really fit in with my workflow.
Okay, cool. So maybe one question about the hardware, because you actually wrote a blog post just about the state of laptops about 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And that the X200 ThinkPad was basically the only good or even the best laptop ever made. And I think that a lot of stuff happened in the laptop space in the last years. So would you still say that laptops are horrible or that it has gotten better?
Well, first of all, I think you can see the X200 in question in the background right here in the video. And I still use it, but it's not my daily driver anymore. Indeed, things have improved marginally in the last 4 years, to the point where I believe it's possible that there are two good laptops. I still like the X200, but I also got a Star Labs Starbook Mark IV, I think. And I've been actually pretty satisfied with that. I think has some trade-offs in that it's not as maintainable or repairable as a ThinkPad, which is really without any competition in that respect. But in other respects, it's been very reliable. The hardware is nice. The battery life is significantly better than an ancient ThinkPad. And it doesn't seem to have a lot of bullshit going on, and it works with upstream Linux and everything. So I've been pretty satisfied with that change. And I would say that in the time since that blog post, I came around a little bit more.
Cool. What do you think about the framework laptops?
I've never tried one, and I think it's pretty interesting. Um, I hope that it has great mainline support, and I think the modularity is interesting. The whole modularity compared to mainline thing, I don't know what the mainline story is, but knowing that modularity is accomplished through USB-C and knowing how USB-C works on most mainline kernels makes me unsure. But I'm sure they've got it worked out or will have soon. I don't keep track of what they're working on. But the probably what's going to end up deciding their place in the history of Linux capable laptops is going to be whether or not their repairability pans out in the long term and if they can keep parts on supply and so on.
Yeah, I agree. So then maybe something about the general thought system that you use. And there was a blog post, again, a lot of blog posts in August of 2022 that was called How I Wish I Could Organize My Thoughts. And I thought that was very interesting because you basically mentioned the problem I think a lot of people know. That is, you have a notebook and you write with pen and paper. And then, okay, how do I get it to my digital life? How do I get it online? How can I make edits? If I can't draw, then that is a problem. So has there been a change? Did you find something? I think especially with modern tablets, there are some nice Linux tablets, even with pen support. We have e-ink readers now that are actually usable. Has there been something that you found that works for you?
Sort of. I have promising results recently. I got this Wacom tablet. I've had a few Wacom tablets over the years, but found the software lacking for the use case of note-taking. But I recently found OurNote, which is a free software note-taking app, which I think maybe is close to what I was describing in that blog post. And I haven't used it as part of my workflow too much yet. I just messed around with it. Remains to be seen if it will be a big part of my workflow. I mainly expect that it might be useful if I have to do a really big thought process where I have to design a large interconnected system over the course of days and keep a large diagram going and whatever. I was thinking about doing that for some operating system development tasks. But prior to trying OurNote, and still as my mainstay approach, I just have a notebook with pen and paper that I use for quick diagramming and quick notes. And also, I just use Vim. I have text files littered all over my hard drive. Many of my projects have a file called notes.txt or to-do.txt. And if I were to do a find /-name to-do.txt, I'd probably come up with 1,000 answers. And then I just kind of keep an editor buffer open to take notes or keep track of what I'm doing or thinking about as I work. And that's usually what works for me.
Okay. Have you ever tried using Obsidian, or do you know about Obsidian?
I've heard about it and I have some friends who use it, but I've not tried it myself and I don't know much about it.
Okay. Because I think the interesting part is that it's basically just a collection of Markdown files and you can edit them with Vim or whatever, but it gives you the opportunity to link them and also cluster some to more of a big picture.
Yeah, I didn't find that particularly compelling as it fits into my workflow because I already kind of have that. I mean, I just have text files organized around the directory hierarchy of my local file system, and this lends them some implicit structure. Like I said before, this is kind of like the Unix is my IDE thing, where I just rely on the Unix file system to organize things in a way that works for me. And so it's obviously more fit to purpose to use something designed in the way Obsidian is, but it's a marginal value add compared to what I'm doing now. And I don't necessarily see that as enough to add the overhead of learning a new tool. And I don't need any like fancy cloud options either, because all of my computers are on a VPN, and so I just have I can mount their file systems from another city or whatever I need to do to get access to my data.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's talk about AI, especially your post about AI, which I find very interesting because you made some predictions, and I think that's always fun. Because it was about 9 months ago, and we can see that some of them have become very real. Some of them were, for example, a reduction in the labor force for skilled creative work, what I think we saw recently, especially. Then the elimination of humans in customer support roles, which also has been heavily introduced. Then the good old book farms that, we also saw. And one of the main ones, AI-generated content that is literally everywhere.
Yes.
And these have all been very negative, of course. So my question now is, do you see any positive AI technologies that are in development or that are out there?
I mean, I have to admit that in some respect, it's cool. Like being able to type a phrase, any phrase you want, and have a bot come up with an image that represents that phrase, or being able to hold something resembling a meaningful conversation with a computer. Like it's cool in like the tech demo sense, and like even if it weren't for how gross it feels, I would maybe like have some use for like image generators to just maybe if I imagine some crazy scene and I want a cool piece of artwork to make a wallpaper from, there could be a use case there. But like these are like it's kind of cool, right? That doesn't mean that it's amazing or the next big thing or justifies anything near the level of hyper real world deployment we're seeing. And it's just so dissonant from the coolness aspect of it to how much it's being sold that it just makes me sick.
Okay. And when you say you feel gross when using it, do you mean the aspect of that it replaces some humans, or that it's just so much sold that it feels almost bad to use it?
I mean, it's a combination of that and more. It's that, I'm somebody who has commissioned artists before, and I enjoy valuing the labor of creative work. My avatar, the astronaut thing, I commissioned, and I've commissioned artwork for the home as well. And I definitely have an appreciation for the labor value of creativity that I want to reward. And that's not to say that I necessarily believe that AI in that creative sense is infringing upon labor. I think the more urgent labor concerns have to do with things like the support ticketing systems and so on, taking humans out of the loop. But also it's that I don't like the feeling that I'm participating in this hyper-capitalized exploitative system. I don't like the fact that it depends on gross misuse of resources and an unreasonable environmental footprint. Like the coolness is kind of stymied by all of this baggage that it comes with for me.
Okay. So I'm guessing that you don't use AI in any capacity for yourself.
No, I mean, I've played with it. I've tried to generate a couple of images to see how it works. I've asked programming questions of ChatGPT just to make sure that it wasn't insane that it was bad, and prove that to myself that it was actually bad at giving good answers. And like, so I mean, I'm not completely clean hands here. I've touched it a couple of times just to see what's going on there. But yeah, I don't use it for anything at all, seriously.
Okay. And do you think that there are some developments that could hold future applications that you yourself would support?
Maybe. I mean, I kind of see some of the appeal of like AI coming in to make improvements to like natural language processing for human computer interactions, perhaps like all of these smart assistants that are controlled by Google or Amazon or whatever that are just data mining operations. I don't think that's the future. And I understand that data mining is an intrinsic part of producing an AI that's capable of those things. So I'm not sure how to square that circle. But just the general idea of a vision of setting aside the data mining and things like this, if somebody can come up with an ethical way to produce some kind of AI-driven thing that makes human-computer interactions easier and not infuriating in the way that things like your support chat bots are. If I wanted to say to my house, lock the doors, and I was the kind of person who had a smart house, like I could see some value in those interactions being smoothed over by AI for people who are finding the appeal in that. But I think that's about it.
Okay. And do you think that the open source stuff that is happening in AI, open source models, open source AI applications are better, or would you say that in the end it's still on the same fundamental basis?
I've seen, I think, one AI adjacent thing which came out of open source, which I thought was pretty cool, which was Mozilla Common Voice, which sourced ethically sourced samples from the general public of voice and speech and so on, and then used these for an open source model for TTS and speech recognition. And I thought that was really cool. I was really impressed by that. But people who are just trying to replicate what Meta is doing or Google is doing, but open source, I'm not as excited about.
Yeah. So continuing on the open source topic, how did you start getting into the whole free software community, the open source stuff?
Well, it was a long time ago. I think I found the idea of sharing code and collaborating code came to me very naturally. There was this, in my early programming projects, this sense of it felt good just to include the code, even before I understand free software philosophy or the practical application of licenses and so on. If I were to release software I made, I would generally include the source code as a matter of course, just because it felt like the right thing to do. And I wanted to show off the source code as much as I wanted to show off the software itself. And I depended on reading a lot of code in order to learn how to write. So it kind of felt like a closed loop in that respect. And then I kind of gradually came around to understanding and interacting with open source projects online, seeing things like software licenses and reading about the philosophy and participating in the zeitgeist kind of just gradually formed this identity for me.
Cool. So you've written quite a lot about ups and downs of different free software communities. And do you have any tips for people that want to start contributing to a project and maybe are intimidated or afraid of making mistakes or making the other developers slower?
I think that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to feel intimidated, but generally speaking, what's most rewarded by the free software community is work. And there's not really this culture of having to earn your place. It's just all of the code is available for you to download and start working on and make the changes you want. And if you put that work in, odds are will be appreciated and not really questioned. Are you good enough, or do you know what you're doing? And if you're especially friendly and polite and respectful to the people that you're asking for their attention and their labor for reviewing your work or discussing what you want to do, if you come in with an attitude of professionalism and respect, most places will be very pleased to work with you, and it will come very naturally. Even a brand new face, if they come into a project with this attitude, is generally going to be well received with no fanfare. And so be brave and try to find the solutions that you need. Be a self-starter and try to be self-motivating. And when you ask for help or start to participate in the community, just have a respect and honor for the fact that the people around you are people who are volunteering their labor to a common cause, and you will find success.
So now the other way around, how can you attract contributors as an open source maintainer?
That is a much more intricate question indeed. I think from my role as a maintainer of many projects, I think that this aspect of it is the key to your project's success. And if you want to be prolific, it's very important. The easiest way to become a prolific programmer is to be good at getting people to help you, and then you can kind of cheat it. So generally speaking, it's about leading by example and setting the kind of culture that you want. So this process I just explained from the contributor side, try to facilitate an environment like that where you're warm and welcoming to people and also focusing on professionalism and the common goals. But for your case, especially focus on the fact that that you're honoring your volunteers, because generally speaking, in most open source projects, people are not getting paid to work, and you need to really take that into account and manage your expectations for what people will do, and encourage people to be self-motivated, self-starters, to work on the things that are important to them, and focus on enabling people to work on the things that are important to them. And as people become more familiar with the project, try to elevate them to the positions and to the responsibilities that they deserve. Encourage people to take responsibilities and empower them with those responsibilities when they're able to, and the community will scale much better than if we try to just lead it from the top down.
Yeah, I think the enabling part is also very important.
It's extremely important.
One thing I was wondering is, how do you enable other people, especially from a technical side? I mean, of course, writing good code is probably one of the best ways, but also the technical documentation stuff, technical writing. And I think in open source, it is very different than, I guess, than in a corporate setting. And so how can you make sure that your technical documentation, technical writing, your code is more or less universally understood in a way that you can just set it out online and people are able to understand it that well that they can contribute to your project?
I think that it is possible to write unreadable code, but if you're using a consistent style guide and putting some degree of care into your work, I think most projects which are the output of that kind of attitude of just a simple, we have a style guide and we follow it and we try to do our best with what we're writing, that's generally enough to make code that people can approach. And I think that the idea of being intimidated by a new code base is a very real feeling, but at the same time that most people in most code bases can figure it out. And so it is true that code is written to be read more so than anything else, but also I don't think you need to sweat it particularly much. I think what's more important to attracting contributors is to make the code easily accessible, to make the community easily accessible, and to make the processes clear for how people can get involved, and to kind of grease the wheels of process more so than focusing on the code itself.
Okay. So now one topic that is still very new, but how can one make money in the world of free software and open source?
Well, making money in the world of free software and open source has all of the same challenges and strategies that you would have trying to make money in any other domain, with the exception that you're constrained by the free software definition or the open source definition, which is a challenging set of constraints indeed, but at the same time, it's not as different from any other kind of business. The thing that many people don't understand when thinking about how to make money from open source is thinking that the key is just to make good software and that the money will come. And that is far, far, far from the case. The key is to make a good business and to have open source be involved in your business. So for SourceIt, for example, we write 100% free software, but I spent a lot of time and attention designing a business model that worked, and the nitty-gritty work of dealing with, gross words like accounting and revenue and profits and projections and forecasts and these things, is really, really important to making a business work. Being open source is not a golden ticket. It's more constraining than any other way of making software, and it makes it more difficult to make a business, which is why all of those aspects that a lot of hackers don't want to think about, the boring stuff that the suits are responsible for, are really important to making a free software business work. So you have to focus on the business model just as much as, or even more so, as you focus on what the software is.
So what was the project that ultimately allowed you to do open source full time? Was it SourceHut?
It was SourceHut, yeah. And it was designed for that purpose in mind. The big part of the goals of SourceHut as a project, not just as a software project, but as a social project or a human endeavor in a broader sense, was designed explicitly to be something which would become financially sustainable and even profitable.
Okay. And do you have plans for SourceHut to scale it, or would you like to keep it as a level that it is now?
We have plans to ideally scale it at the right pace. I think that our main goal is not necessarily growth. We're not a growth-driven business, and we reject kind of this toxic growth at all costs culture. So our primary concern is to be stable and reliable. And from a financial perspective, there are some financial constraints which are necessary for a definition of stable and reliable in a broader sense than just how software can be stable. The business also has to be stable for it to achieve its goals. And we have accomplished that a while ago, and we're growing slowly since, and I think we're okay with that. But we do have plans to keep working on the alpha and eventually graduate to a beta and to a full production release. And there's some business choices along the way, which will ideally bring in some more revenue for us. And we do have plans for things to do at a larger scale. And we have a plan for scaling up the infrastructure as needed. And we have a plan for scaling up the business as needed, and for scaling up the ambitions within free software as needed. In some ways that we might approach this, but we're also, as our fundamental goal, just want to have something which is sustainable and not necessarily growth-oriented.
Is the infrastructure currently in the Netherlands?
Yes. We also have a backup center in California.
Okay. And is there a plan to globalize the infrastructure?
Not presently. We might do a second site somewhere in Europe as a backup or failover or for redundancy, maybe for load balancing, depending on how it goes. But we are not intending to globalize the infrastructure because the cost-benefit ratio doesn't really work out. It would be very expensive to do that, and I'm not sure that it makes sense with our margins to go for that.
Okay. And have you benchmarked the stuff like latency and connectivity from different countries?
To some extent, yes. But generally speaking, SourceHut, in terms of the network, is small enough in terms of how lightweight it is on network usage by at least an order of magnitude compared to websites like GitHub, or even 2 orders of magnitude compared to some like GitLab, that the payload that has to be delivered over the network to facilitate service is small enough and fast enough that even with perhaps an outsized effect on latency, the round trip total package tends to be the fastest in the industry, regardless of where you are in the world.
Okay, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So now I would like to shift to a very, very interesting topic, and that is Hare. Mm-hmm. I think it's pronounced Hare, right?
Hare, yes, like the animal.
Yeah. Okay. So you started Hare about 4.5 years ago, if I calculate that correctly.
Yeah, something like that.
Initially in stealth, and then 2 years ago you opened it to the public.
Yeah.
And I would like you to just give me the explanation. So what is Hare, first of all?
So Hare is a systems programming language. You can use it to write compilers, operating systems, networking tools, multimedia, core utilities, build automation, that kind of thing, low-level stuff. Most of the stuff you would use C for, Hare is also equally suited to, which is designed for simplicity and for long-term stability.
Cool. Why was it created?
Because there was nothing else like it.
So, I have a quote. Mm-hmm. We have made the bold decision to make a number of guarantees when we release Hare 1.0, chief among them being that the language grammar and semantics will be permanently frozen. Now, my question is, has this ever done before?
This has been done once or twice. I should have looked up the name, but I forget. There's a functional programming language, maybe it's Scheme or something, which has kind of frozen the language semantics a while ago. But it's quite rare to take on this particular ambition, I think.
And how confident are you that it will work out?
I'm less. I'm mostly optimistic that it will work out. I think that we will achieve the goal of making something which we are comfortable calling done. But it remains to be seen if that proves to be something which is useful to people in the indefinite future. Because we can build something for the future, but only the future can decide if they want it.
Yeah. So is there a timeline when 1.0 will be released?
We don't really have a timeline, and we don't structure the project around them, but I hope it will be fewer than 4.5 more years.
Okay, that's cool. And is there an alternative to making a language last 100 years?
Well, sure. There's the way that most languages do it, which is to make it last significantly less.
Okay.
Languages like Rust or Python or so on, they evolve continuously, and sometimes they make breaking changes, and sometimes they change what it means to write idiomatic code in a way that causes projects to become stale over time. And this approach requires a process of continuous learning and upkeep and maintenance from the communities that depend on these languages. This is the alternative.
Yeah. Was there a motivation or was there a project that motivated you for it? Or was it just a sense that you thought, why is there not a solution like this? Okay, I'm going to build one.
I mean, I did look around for what people were working on. I didn't exactly have stability as a center of the project. It was something I very much valued, and that came later when I decided to make something myself, to decide what the core values would be. But I did shop around, and I didn't find anything that satisfied me. But in the end, I chose to make it because I feel like the programming industry or the software industry has this kind of addiction to something analogous to fast fashion, where you make something for today, and that's all it's for, is today. And maybe it will last 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but most software is not made with staying power in mind these days. And I really wanted to find a way to change that, to make it so that computers were reliable and predictable for a long time, and that we had the tools to make them so. And I thought that was absent.
There's a lot of work coming your way, right? You have the porting, you have the standard library that needs to be well done. You have the compiler that, of course, evolves. And you also have to make sure that version 1 is able to uphold your promise. How do you manage all that?
By not worrying about how long it will take. It's focusing on getting the right people interested and working on it and excited about working on it, and then just allowing the work to proceed for as long as it takes. And if we keep at it, we'll get there. And if we panic about how much work it is, we won't.
That's a good approach.
Yeah.
So do you think you could write parts of Sway in Hare at some point?
I think, yes, it would be definitely possible to write or have written Sway in Hare. But I'm not sure it would be the ideal choice today, because Sway is a program which has quite a few very important dependencies that would be hard to replace. Things like libdrm and OpenGL and XKB Common. There's a lot of things that Sway depends on, and of course, most of all, WL roots. And certainly, all of this stuff could be written in Hare, but Sway benefits massively from the things that it depends on, and having to build those out again would be a challenge that I don't think it would be worth it. If I was evaluating the trade-offs today, I would probably pick C again. But it is possible to do CFFI in Hare. It's not as easy as we would like it to be, and we want to improve it. But for a project like Sway, the math might not work out in Hare's favor today.
So what about embedded projects, especially things like the Raspberry Pi, which, I mean, their ecosystem gets bigger and bigger. I think you already had Helios running on a Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, Helios runs on, is able to run on a Raspberry Pi 3 and 4. The main limitation with using Hare on embedded systems is that we don't have support for 32-bit targets yet, and most embedded systems are 32-bit. It's something we plan on doing. It's in the roadmap, but we haven't found an urgent enough use case to prioritize it. But for 64-bit embedded targets, Hare is definitely a language which is very well suited to it. And if you expand embedded to refer more generally to freestanding projects or these kinds of affairs, Hare becomes a very good choice, which is why like Helios and Bunix and so on have been very comfortable to write in Hare at a very low level and talking directly to the hardware and that kind of thing.
So what are the most urgent points on the roadmap currently?
I would say that we don't generally work with a sense of urgency or of roadmap because it doesn't really mesh with the whole respecting volunteer labor. We can't really put a top-down command structure that says this is what's important to you. So people work on what's important to them. And what's important to me in my role in the project is presently to put a lot of work into refining the standard library. The API is pretty good, but I think we've been working on it for a few years now, and it would be a good time to revisit some of the implementations. And refining it for making it more portable to other targets. And I also want to deal with a few language features that we want. The language itself evolves relatively slowly. I think I have maybe 2 or 3 small new language features that are likely to be done, and that will probably cover it for this year. So mainly it's just a process of gradually developing it into something we feel is complete, and then a process of proving to ourselves that it is complete, and then calling it done.
Then Ares.
Yeah.
I hope I pronounced that right as well.
I call it Ares, but I don't fuss over the pronunciation.
Okay. Ares. Ares is the demo operating system right now that uses Hare and the Helios microkernel that is written in Hare.
Mm-hmm.
And what's your future for Ares?
Well, it is a research project. There's actually 2 major operating systems written in Hare now after I did Bunix last month. But I think it's very much a research project, and it's a way for me to explore operating system designs and novel concepts in operating system designs. And I think an operating system is one of the most ambitious projects that you can take on, not necessarily in terms of implementation, though that's definitely the case, but especially in terms of design. And getting the design right is very, very important and very, very labor intensive. And so I think that before it's known exactly what Ares will be or what the future holds for Ares, it needs to have more time in this state of being heavily research oriented and testing out different design concepts and ways of designing and structuring an operating system before we find exactly what is going to work.
And so how much time do you spend on the projects currently? Do you have a fixed time that you spend on either?
Not so much. I just kind of work on whatever is the most urgent at any particular day or week. And I plan out maybe 1 to 2 weeks in advance, or keep some major objectives for each of my projects in mind. But then the actual scheduling of what I'm working on is kind of on an ad hoc basis, unless somebody goes out of the way to ask me to prioritize something.
Would you say that Hare is the most difficult project that you undertook?
Maybe. It depends on what sort of difficulty you're talking about, because for Hare, Certainly designing and implementing the language, especially in the first couple of years, was a lot of work and a bit of a challenge indeed. But the more important challenge was building the community around it, which is what's really been the key to its success. And I put a lot of attention and energy into developing that community and building a space or an environment which is healthy and collaborative and fun to work in, which is the most essential thing to Hare success more so than anything else. But in terms of things like technical difficulty, Helios is probably the more challenging project.
Okay. Did you start to write Hare on your own, like completely alone when you initially worked on it before publishing it?
Well, I started on it more or less on my own, but I consulted with friends and peers, people that I knew would be interested to bounce ideas off of and talk about the design, and just part of my general social experience is to talk about my work with these people in my life. And some of them contributed design ideas or spitballed on different approaches, and then it wasn't long before they started participating in the actual development too.
I think there was a ray tracer built in Hare already, and I think there are some OpenGL bindings as well.
Yeah, and Vulkan as well.
Okay, Vulkan as well. So would it be possible to write a small game engine in Hare at this point already?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know if there's any in development?
I know that one of the people working on Hare, Vlad, was looking into this, but hasn't prioritized it recently. I don't think that anybody's working on it, but there is people who mess around with Raylib or Vulkan or OpenGL, and this has received a fair bit of attention from people just playing around. So when somebody shows up who thinks that Hare might be suited to the development of a game engine, they'll find a fair number of resources waiting for them to apply.
Is there any roadblock currently that would maybe hinder the development, or would you say that's basically full-fledged, that a 2D game engine could be possible at this point for an x86 architecture?
I mean, 2D, 3D, x86, ARM64, I think it would all be pretty achievable today if somebody wanted to build a game engine out of what we already have. Any kind of game engine, I think, could be relatively attainable. I think the main problem would come with a couple of things where you have, some challenges with actually presenting a window. So we have OpenGL and Vulkan and so on. We have SDL bindings for putting up your game window, and you can render stuff into it with OpenGL and Vulkan. But if you don't want to use SDL, the Wayland bindings are somewhat immature. It is definitely possible to use them to do a Vulkan game, but I don't know if I would ship it to production yet. And if you don't use SDL, you also might have some challenges with audio. Audio is really the only solution that works today reliably is through SDL. And we have like some Pipewire stuff, and we have a little bit of multimedia stuff, but not much. So that would probably be the other challenge. But if you're comfortable using SDL for audio and window management, I think you could build something today with what we already have. Maybe the only other caveat is that we have fairly immature support for GUIs. So if you need if you want to make a full-fledged like Unity style game engine with like a project editor and so on, there's not going to be a lot available to you for building GUIs. But if you want to build something more like, Minecraft, a domain-specific game engine, I think you could do it today.
Awesome. Sounds like a good project.
Yeah.
Cool. So is there anything that I forgot talking about Hare or Ares? Anything that you want to mention?
Did you hear anything about Bunix?
I mean, you wrote a Unix clone just for fun, right?
Yeah, that was the idea.
Is there anything that you learned that you didn't think you would learn before?
Yes. I learned first that it was considerably easier to achieve a lot of things that I didn't expect to achieve. than I had planned. I think that Hare really, really shines for writing a Unix kernel, but I think if you are starting from the axiom that you're building a Unix and not really designing an operating system, but just implementing one, especially if you're willing to pull in third-party code, like start from muscle libc instead of starting a libc from scratch, for example, you can actually get pretty damn far pretty easily in terms of like getting real-world Unix software to run. And the other thing I learned, which I expected to learn, is that signals are even worse than I thought.
Okay. Did you have anything Hare related that you changed, like the language, while working with it?
No, there's nothing that I changed while I was working with it, but I did identify a few places that could be improved, which I will work on in the future, but not as part of I didn't interrupt my work on Bunix to address these things. One was that I think there's room for Hare to have a special operator to create uninitialized variables. Hare has mandatory initialization for all variables, and they also have some kinds of types which don't have default values, so you have to explicitly specify what the default value is, which is very important for having well-defined behavior, is that you don't have undefined variables. That said, this has worked very well in the context of traditional Unix user space programs are generally really easily able to cope with that limitation or constraint of Hare. But I found that in a kernel context where all of the semantics around memory management and how you use memory becomes significantly more important, I found that in this case, there's actually a pretty significant demand for having uninitialized variables. So I made a proposal I made an RFC for Hare to suggest uninitialized variables, and I think it was well received. So this is probably going to be put in place eventually. And the other thing I learned was that I think that the process of porting Hare to an operating system, which is not really as fleshed out as a typical modern Unix is. So Linux is a very complete OS. The BSDs are very complete OSs. Porting the Hare standard library to a less complete operating system was not difficult, not prohibitively difficult, but it could be done easier. So I think there's room to improve the standard library to make it easier to port to new operating systems. And I think I'm going to put some work into refactoring it for that purpose.
Will you continue to work on Bunix?
Maybe. If I find it fun.
No plans.
Yeah. I mean, it's a Unix-like operating system, and I could keep working on it forever. And I have things in mind that could be done, and maybe if I feel like having a little fun weekend project, I'll implement a new driver or something. But I don't intend to make it into a serious endeavor or a serious project that I'm committed to. It just will continue to be fun for me as I feel the need to have some fun with it.
Were there any parallels to Ares?
Yeah, I actually learned a lot from this project, which will be applicable to Ares. And Ares also contributed a lot to Bunix. Bunix is mostly original code, but I definitely could not have written it so quickly without having the experience of having already done an operating system through Helios and Ares. And there was some boilerplate OS code in Hare that was just pulled out of Helios and stuck into the Bunix kernel for like some common stuff like setting up an interrupt vector. So there's a few small pieces of Helios which live on inside of Bunix, and like the EFI bootloader as well also was forked from the Bunix bootloader, or the Bunix bootloader was forked from the Helios bootloader. But more interestingly than that is the information flowing in the other direction, which is that I came away from the Bunix project with a greater appreciation for monolithic kernels and not to the point where I think that Helios ought to be one, but maybe there is room to reconsider how much goes in the kernel. And also, so a lot of the ways I structure the Helios or Ares user space, I think, could be improved with some inspiration I got while working on Bunix as well. And so I think Ares is kind of in design hell right now, and Bunix gave me a lot of insights to get out of it.
So I think you worked on Bunix for 27 days?
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah. So how big is the project? Do you know approximately?
It's hard to measure because I just vendored a bunch of third-party code in the Git repository. So if you just look at lines of code in the Git repository, it's going to sum up not just the Bunix code, but also like I stuck Dash in there and muscle libc and gzip and so on when I ported them. So those all contribute to the overall line count. So it's a bit fuzzy, but I think the kernel is something like 20,000 lines of Hare. I could double check that. Yeah, so the kernel is 26,000 lines of Hare code, almost all of which is original, but some of which was ported from the Hare standard library or from Helios. And there's, I don't know, another few 100,000 lines of third-party code from all the ports I added from Vim and TCC and gzip and so on. And then there's the libc, which is forked from muscle libc. So again, a lot of that is not original, but a decent amount of it, anywhere where it touched the host, of course, had to be rewritten. And then also in the kernel, I vendored two third-party dependencies. I vendored LWEXT4 for ext4 support in the file system driver, and I vendored libvterm to help make it less of a hassle to write the terminal emulation on the VT. So it's hard to say exactly how big any of it is. Do you measure the kernel in Hare? Do you measure the kernel with Hare and the vendor dependencies combined? Or do you measure the user space or the libraries? Like, it's unclear, but I think maybe the most reliable number would be that 26,000 lines of Hare code in the kernel.
And you could run Doom on it.
And you can run Doom on it.
So when is the Doom port coming to Ares?
Oh, Ares was able to run Doom like a year ago.
Oh, okay. Oh, then it was the old blog post. I think then it wasn't there yet.
Yeah, I think I haven't maintained the Doom port. I just did it for fun in a weekend on Ares. And I think enough of Ares has changed that it probably doesn't run anymore. But if you want to run Doom on Ares today, you're just probably 30 minutes of fixing the compiler issues and it'll run again.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. So, yeah, thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to maybe mention? I think your blog is a very good source of information.
I can't think of anything right now. I think that covers most of what we talked about, right?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, Drew, thank you so much. Also, thank you for I've been running Sway for 2 years now.
Oh, great.
And I love it. Cannot imagine going somewhere else.
You have Simon Sir to thank for that now, as he's been the maintainer for the past 2 years.
Okay, I will shoot him a message.
Send him your love.
Yes, I will do that. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. This was very interesting and a really nice conversation. Yeah,
I was really happy to get your email. Thank you so much for inviting me. I had a great time talking.
Cool. I'm really glad to hear that. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.